Dr. Jon Nese, glad to have you back on. I have this very exciting thing in my hand right here. It's your
Oh,
book.
that looks familiar. I have one of those too.
This is exciting because last year at this time we were sitting here talking about this, and this was in the works, and now it's here. It's published. It's done. This is very exciting, and exciting for me because we're going to get a deeper dive into not just the Battle of Gettysburg, but the whole campaign. We're going to get a little American history from you here as well, which I bet you've learned a lot about over the past couple of years.
I have. My father, who taught American history in high school, would be very proud.
Oh, that's amazing. What a great combination of weather and history for you. All right. So let's talk about your book for one, but I also want to go back and talk about how this all got started. Have you always been this history buff or especially interested in this particular part of American history? Why did you start studying this?
Well, the overlap of weather with history has always fascinated me. And when I was taking you back 25 years, I was at the Franklin Institute Science Museum in Philadelphia. We would do little 1 minute features for the local PBS station, and Gettysburg weather during the Civil War was one of them. And that sort of got me interested, and that blossomed into something I did when I was at the Weather Channel about the intersection of weather and the battle. Out of the blue, I got a call from a licensed Gettysburg battlefield guide back in 2018, who ends up being my co-author, Jeffrey Harding. And he asked me some questions about the weather during the battle that people want to know. What did it really feel like? And so we went to work.
Okay, so you got partnered up with Jeff and you started working on this book. And when I talked to you last year, we kind of dug into the battle itself.
Yes.
But can we start a little bit more at the beginning and what happened at the beginning of the campaign and then each step of the way, how weather impacted it? So let's start
Sure.
with kind of moving north and what happened there.
Well, the armies were congregated in the vicinity of Fredericksburg, Virginia in early June of 1863. That's when Lee decided to make his move and come north. And so we started on June 3rd, 1863, which is considered the beginning of the campaign. And we looked at the weather as best we could every day for the next 42 days, which takes us to July 14th, which was the day when Lee finally recrossed the Potomac to get back into Southern territory. So we looked at that entire 42-day period. And it featured some really interesting weather, some of which was known a little bit about. I mean, they knew there was a big heat wave June 15th through 18th, but nobody knew how hot it was really. I mean, there were a few scanty observations from Georgetown in Washington, D.C. And so we looked for as much data as we could to validate and quantify what the soldiers said about that heat wave. And then there's a lot of interest in the retreat. Lee was unable to recross the Potomac because the river was too high. And there's very scanty observations about precipitation out in the area where they recrossed. And so we did our best to try to figure out how much rain fell.
What were weather instruments like in 1863?
So the quality differed. It depends on where you got your instrumentation. At that time, the Smithsonian was running a network of observers, and there were sort of like 3 or 4 levels of observers. There were the observers who didn't have any instruments, so they basically reported the rain started at 2 o'clock. Then there were observers who had thermometers, and pretty good thermometers, mercury thermometers. There were observers who had barometers, and then there were observers who had the humidity instrument, the psychrometer, which helps you get a sense of the relative humidity and the dew point, those things which are of interest to meteorologists. So it depended on where you were. And we ended up mining data from the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., which was sort of at that time state of the art. And nobody had really used that data to apply to the Civil War. And they observed, get this, 8 times a day, every 3 hours, pressure, temperature, something called the wet bulb temperature, which enables you to get humidity. They even had a thermometer sitting a couple inches above the grass in the sun. So you could get a sense of what it felt like to be outside in the sun near the ground, like a soldier might be.
Mm.
So that ended up, I think, being the biggest part of what we used in terms of new data. And then there were observers in places such as Frederick, Maryland. There really were no observers in Virginia. Once the Civil War started, nobody observed anymore. And we had observations from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania as well, which helped a lot because Harrisburg is only 35 miles from Gettysburg.
Okay, so how do you do it? Do you throw all this stuff on a map and then just kind of extrapolate and figure out what was going on in each location?
You know what? You nailed it. I mean, I got some Civil War maps that Jeff helped me locate that showed where the troops were every day between June 3rd and July 14th. I took those maps to my local printer and I blew them up like 3 feet by 2 feet. And then I just started plotting soldier comments and weather data on these maps. You know as well as I do how much that helps. We sort of need to see it all
Yeah. Oh,
laid
for
out in
sure.
front of us. And then I think the other innovation we brought to the campaign is that NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and you know this, but your listeners might not, actually has a computer program that can rebuild what the best guess at what the weather maps would have looked like. Every 3 hours, get this, going back to 1836. It's an online tool. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, this is fabulous. We can take the best technology available, bring in what few observations they had. And then you remember from your meteorological studies, Emily, we learned things about the geostrophic wind and the thermal wind and the different balances that exist in the atmosphere. You can rebuild sort of a best guess weather map. And so we used those and we published a bunch of them in the book in color, surface maps and maps at 500 millibars, right up around 20,000 feet. And so we tried to incorporate that into explaining what the soldiers were observing and to sort of validate it. And that was really fun. So this is kind of like, to me, a meteorological forensic puzzle.
Yeah. And I love how you explained it in the book, how it's like computer modeling, but instead of going forward, you're going
Going
backwards.
backwards. That's right.
Interesting.
So it's kind of a forensic analysis, and kudos to NOAA. I mean, folks think of NOAA, oh, yeah, that's the National Weather Service, but we know how important NOAA is to meteorological science in this country. And kudos to them for making this publicly available. So, and I have my students here at Penn State, I'm like, go back and reconstruct the weather on your birthday,
Yeah.
the day you were born. You know, what did the weather maps look like that day? And then tell me, based on those maps, what you think happened in the town where you were born. It's and of course the farther back you go in time, the rougher the maps are. So you couldn't use, I tell my co-author Jeffrey Harding, Jeff, it's guidance, it's not gospel.
Hmm.
But it's a fascinating tool that was very useful in this endeavor.
Oh man, I'm jealous of your students. I would have loved to do that in college. Very cool.
Well, you can always go back and
I'm
get
coming
another
back.
degree.
Okay, so I'm hearing a lot about what Jeff got out of you and what he learned about the weather, but I'm curious about what you got from Jeff and kind of these personal stories that maybe he helped you put together the weather puzzle as well.
The appreciation for what these soldiers endured, basically living their lives outside almost all the time, is what I took most from this endeavor. Jeff compiled a Word document that, when I first got hold of it, was more than 400 pages long of soldier quotes. So Jeff knows how to mine the Civil War diaries, all those sources where the soldiers may have published their information. And many of them did. And of course, a lot of their comments were about what they were wearing, how bad the food was, but a lot of them were about the weather. And so what Jeff brought to me was this down home local approach to what the soldiers were feeling. And you know, when you read their comments, sometimes the weather that they report doesn't necessarily agree. I mean, there would be some days where I'd be writing on my maps, this soldier said it was hot and sticky, but this soldier said it was good for marching. And they're within 20 miles of each other. And I'm thinking, why would that be? Well, you know, partly cloudy day in summer, maybe over here it's feels okay. And so I took that appreciation from Jeff. Jeff is also a extremely knowledgeable Civil War historian buff. And yeah, the personal stories we have about the one Medal of Honor recipient, the only Medal of Honor recipient during the Civil War, who received the medal because he saved a soldier who had sunstroke. And he stayed with this soldier even under enemy fire and got him to safety. We have a story in the book about a gentleman who owned a vineyard in Front Royal, Virginia, and his son was killed in the war, mere miles from their home. I mean, such sadness. And we have some vignettes about some of the observers, everyday people who just decided, yeah, I'll be an observer. I'll be an observer for the Smithsonian Institution. It's a couple in Sykesville, Maryland, who dutifully observed during the Civil War. You know, the guy who observed in Gettysburg, he was a professor at Pennsylvania College, which is now Gettysburg College. One of the observers in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania was a medical doctor. So there really are some good stories in our book as well as documenting the impact of the weather on the soldiers.
Can you give me a little overview of what the weather was like during the battle?
Yeah, well, during the battle, those 3 days, it got progressively warmer and more humid. The peak of the heat was on the third day of the battle, July 3rd, 1863. We know the temperature, based on the observer in Gettysburg, was 87 degrees at 2 p.m. that day. He only observed 3 times a day, 9 a.m., 2 p.m., 9 p.m., so we don't really know what the high was. But based on extrapolating information from Washington, D.C., Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, we believe the heat index at the peak of the heat on July 3rd, which would have coincided with the very famous Pickett's Charge, which was the culmination of the Confederate attempt to defeat the Union at Gettysburg, and it failed. We feel pretty confident the heat index was 100 or higher. And of course, a lot of the soldiers were laying in the sun for 3 hours. So we know it can feel 10 to 15 degrees hotter in the sun. Some of them are prone on the ground. So we can extrapolate from Washington, D.C., that sort of temperature out in the sun, a couple inches above the ground, what it might have felt like in Gettysburg. It could have felt to the soldiers who were prone on the ground in the sun in excess of 130 degrees. And they're in their uniforms, and they're not necessarily well fed or well hydrated. So the peak of the heat was definitely on the 3rd, the last day of the battle. And then once the battle ended, it rained a lot. And that made it hard. And that made it hard for Lee to retreat and for Meade to follow.
Yeah, tell me about the river and trying to cross the river.
Right. When the Confederate Army, Lee's army, came north and crossed the Potomac, of course, they knew where to cross. They knew where the river was lowest. And a lot of them crossed near Williamsport, Maryland. And we know from soldier accounts that when they crossed the first time, the water was maybe up to their knees or their hips. So we know that the water was a couple feet deep. But when the Confederates tried to retreat back to Williamsport, Maryland, a few of them got across on July 4th and July 5th, but then the river got too high. And as best we can tell, it may have peaked at 15 to 20 feet. And you're not crossing a river. You're not wading, you're not fording is the word they use. You're not fording a river with your artillery when the river's that high. So Lee was effectively trapped in Williamsport, Maryland for the better part of 5, 6, 7, 8 days until the river fell. And they were not able to finally get across until the night of July 13th, the morning of the 14th. And the last Confederate soldiers crossed the river back to the safety of the southern side of the river by around lunchtime on July 14th, 1863. And that's when the story of the Gettysburg Campaign ends.
Which part of the campaign do you think was most impacted by weather?
The armies endured a 4-day heat wave from June 15th to June 18th, 1863, when they were primarily still in Virginia. That once I started looking at the data that was available and comparing that data to modern day statistics, we came to the conclusion that this heat wave from June 15th to 18th was historic in nature in terms of June heat waves in that part of the country. I mean, the high temperature in Washington, D.C., which is not where the soldiers were, but it's close enough that an extrapolation is not a stretch, exceeded 93 degrees for 4 consecutive days. The dew points were in the 70s most of the time. You do that heat index calculation, you're in the 100 and teens for heat indices for at least one or two of those days. And so I dug up hourly data from the 2 airports, downtown Washington, D.C., and then Dulles, which are not all that far from where many of the troops were. And I looked at hourly data back to 1962 and asked a very simple question. How often does the heat index get that high in modern day in those places? And you just don't find it. So we make the argument, to answer your question, Reader's Digest version, is it was the period from the 15th to the 18th where sunstroke was rampant. I mean, when you look at the statistics, the medical statistics, I don't have them at my fingertips now, but you're talking about hundreds of soldiers falling out from sunstroke. That, and one of the issues here, and it wasn't equally, the misery was not equally divided between the two armies, because it turns out that Lee's army mostly rested during that heat wave because they were already far enough north that they were where they wanted to be. But the Union army had fallen behind. And so many of the divisions of the Union army went on forced march during that heat wave. And we remark in the book what General Hooker wouldn't have given for a good 7-day forecast. Because you know as well as I do, today, if you have a 7-day forecast, which generally speaking, even days 4, 5, 6, and 7, we generally are in the ballpark, right? If I told you that it was going to be 93 degrees or hotter for 4 consecutive days, you are not going to plan on marching your armies 20 to 25 miles a day during that period. You're going to rest. But the Union didn't have the advantage of a weather forecast, and they needed to march to catch up to Lee.
Interesting. Is there any part of the story that you thought, history would have been different if the forecast had been something that they knew about?
Well, deciding the impact on history is a tough one. But certainly, if they had modern weather forecasts, even reasonably accurate forecasts, and that had been worked into the planning, there's absolutely no doubt that the Union could have conserved some energy during that heat wave. And there was also a lot of catching up, even leading right up to the battle. I mean, I think folks who know a little bit about Gettysburg may think that, well, the armies were all there at the beginning of the battle, right? So July 1st, the sun comes up, they start shooting at each other, and everybody's already there. But the truth is they weren't all there. There was a lot of hurrying up to get additional troops to Gettysburg, and some of the troops didn't arrive until the 2nd. And so certainly a military planner with the benefit of even an accurate 2-day forecast would have endeavored to get everybody to, Gettysburg was kind of a chance meeting. I mean, people say, why Gettysburg? What's going on here? And it turns out that Gettysburg had this spoke of roads, just 8, 10 roads just coming in. There were only 2,000 residents there. I mean, it was a small town in south central Pennsylvania, but it's not far from the Mason-Dixon line. And for that time, 2,000 people, that's a fairly bustling community. I mean, some of Lee's troops had made it as far north as Harrisburg. In fact, they had plans to perhaps take over the capital, which Harrisburg being the capital of Pennsylvania. But once it became apparent that troops were congregating closer to Gettysburg, Lee called his troops back and said, we need to consolidate. So, I mean, the question you asked was, what impact on history might this have had? And I think we don't really make any statements to address that question. Instead, what we say is, with this new information about the weather, historians can now continue to debate. So it becomes sort of our contribution is to paint the weather picture. And now other historians may want to use what we did to think about the question you just asked.
Was there any part of this in the research that caught you off guard that you were really surprised by?
To be honest, I was kind of surprised that, as best I can tell, I am the first actual degreed meteorologist to author or co-author a book on Gettysburg. And that kind of surprised me because it seems to me that a niche that needed to be filled. I was kind of surprised that no one had ever used this rich data set from the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., and applied it to the Civil War, because the armies were not that far from Washington, D.C. And you know as well as I do, in the summer, whether you're in Northern Virginia, 60 miles southwest of DC, or you're in DC, it feels about the same much of the time, right? And so I was kind of surprised that no one had done this, but as best I can tell, and it's a very rich data set filled with
Hmm.
all kinds of neat information and commentary, making comments about thunderstorms and lightning. And so I guess that surprised me a little bit. I was also surprised when I dug into the data to learn how little data there really was in Northern Virginia, in Virginia as a whole, and what we now consider to be West Virginia. That whole space, when you look at, because we plotted like a little dot on the map for where we had data, and there's this big hole, and it's called Virginia and West Virginia. There was no, there's nothing. So I guess those were some surprises to me. I guess if I'd thought about it critically, well, it's a civil war. They got better things to do. They're not going to be observing the weather, right?
Come
I
on,
mean,
make it a priority.
you and I think about weather observations in a different way. In modern times, we take them for granted. We know that they're reliable and that quality control is good. But back then, this is another thing about the weather observations from the Naval Observatory. The gentleman who we profile in the book, John Roby Eastman, who took most of them, was just a high caliber scientist. I mean, if you and I were interviewing people to be a brand new weather observer, and this gentleman was in the lineup, you and I would both say, we want this person. This is a very reliable scientist who cares about the data. And for that reason, the Naval Observatory data really stood out as a high quality record.
Cool. Was there anything that left you more confused than getting answers? Were you getting so much information that at any point you were like, I can't figure out what happened here because there's conflicting reports?
Well, there were a couple non-critical days. Like non-critical, I mean days when I don't think the weather had much of an impact on the troops, where there were conflicting reports. But now that you mention it, and we do point this out in the book, prior to our work, the description of the weather that occurred during the battle came almost exclusively from the gentleman in Gettysburg. His name was Michael Jacobs. He was a professor at Pennsylvania College, now Gettysburg College, and he observed the weather 3 times a day. And according to his observations, it did not rain during the battle. He had 0 precipitation on July 1st. He had 0 precipitation in his records on July 2nd, and he had 0 precipitation in his records on July 3rd. And that had pretty much been what people used to describe the weather during the battle. Well, when you look at the soldier quotes and some of the other information that we discovered, it very well may have rained on the 3rd day of the battle. And in fact, there's a soldier account of a rainbow at the end of the 3rd day. Now, you and I both know if there's a rainbow, it had to rain. Now, of course, a lot of people look at things in the sky and they have a little bit of color, perhaps like a halo or a
Yeah.
sundog, and they'll call them rainbows, but they're not really. But there was enough information that we gathered to come to the conclusion that it probably did rain at the end of the fighting on the 3rd day of the battle. In fact, Professor Jacobs' son has a narrative where he talks about a thunderstorm that was that occurred later that day. So whether it rained or not during the battle, it didn't rain a lot. If it did, but that was a place where we may have unearthed some things that were previously not well known. What we're working on now is, as morbid as it sounds, there were wounded and dying and dead soldiers left behind in Gettysburg, and they were still there in August. And so we're now looking at August of 1863 and what the weather might have been like.
Mm.
And we're also looking at the weather for the Gettysburg Address later in November of 1863 because we have the data.
Wow.
So I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. It all makes me think too, you were talking about how we have such great data now and how instrumentation is so good. But it also makes me wonder, like, are we going backwards when it comes to some of this, like writing and journaling, and people wrote to each other so much then that you had all this other extra information. It wasn't
Right.
just about numbers, it was about how people
Right.
felt and how they were impacted. Are we doing that wrong now for future generations?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's a good question.
I guess we have our digital footprint, people can watch all the Instagram selfie
Right.
videos of people during this time.
Yeah, and all the webcams that are out there with,
Yeah.
uh, so you can basically replay uh, a day's worth of weather
Yeah.
visually by looking at the sky. I mean, you do have an interesting point. It's funny you should bring that up because I'm teaching next week an adult weather camp here at Penn State. About 25 individuals are coming in from all over the country, and I will be the primary instructor. And I was thinking about how to open this. What are my opening comments? And it was along the lines of what you just said. I was thinking about saying something like, you know what? Comments like, oh, it was really humid today, or that was some thunderstorm last night, are valuable to meteorologists. But the first thing that goes through my mind when somebody says it was really humid yesterday is, well, what was the dew point? I need a number. Or when they talk about that nasty thunderstorm, first thing that goes through my mind is, how many lightning bolts were there per minute? You and I, we like numbers. And so I immediately jump to the quantifying. But the qualitative certainly does have value. I just think it has been overshadowed largely by the technology we now have, which we can basically, in a minute, find out what it looked like yesterday with a video. Maybe not find out what it felt like. But yeah, I
Yeah.
don't do much journaling anymore
Yeah,
on
me neither.
daily life. So you probably did this when you were a kid too. I used to keep a little notebook
Yeah.
back in Steubenville, Ohio, of what happened every day and how much snow there was. Yeah.
And probably how it affected your life.
Well, how many days of school it canceled.
Yep, exactly. John, what's next for you? You mentioned kind of digging in more to Gettysburg. Are there other historical events you're thinking about maybe writing about or studying in the future?
So Jeff has encouraged me to look at some other Civil War events in light of the new data that we have, and that reanalysis system, that National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration online product where you can draw old-timey weather maps. And so I have a feeling that that's where this will go next. I mean, just one example, there's a very famous segment of Civil War history, January 20th and 21st of 1863, called the Mud March. And I don't know a lot about the history, but it's called the Mud March. So I looked up the weather maps on that day, and this occurred in Virginia. And wouldn't you know it, the NOAA reconstruction of the weather that day shows a classic nor'easter. I mean, if I showed you these weather maps, Emily, as a fellow meteorologist, and I said to you, what do you think the weather was like in Northern Virginia on this day? You would look at these maps and you'd be like, well, this was a winter storm. I mean, this was a cold rain. And it was. And so, sort of digging into whether this reanalysis system from NOAA can reproduce the weather conditions that agree with the ground truth, I think is kind of neat. And there are lots of examples from the Civil War where, and I have a feeling, to answer your question directly, that's where some of our efforts will go. We fully expect that some of the techniques we've brought to the table here can be used for other and when I say historical, I don't mean 1994. I mean 1894. I truly mean, more than 100 years ago. I think some of these techniques, what I really mean is before we had a National Weather Service.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as many of your listeners probably know, the Weather Service dates back to 1870-ish, just after the Civil War, when then President Ulysses S. Grant signed the legislation. It wasn't called the National Weather Service back then, but that's when we started having weather maps,
Right.
legitimate weather maps. But prior to that, any weather maps were really kind of unconventional, not official, sort of, you just threw together what you could and tried to make it up. But this new NOAA tool, I think, allows you to do more.
Cool. I'm going to have to check it out. Do you think that because of it, there'll be more people, because meteorologists spend so much time trying to predict the future and looking forward. Do you think that more people will start looking backwards and gathering intel from that and learning from the past and not just trying to predict the future?
I don't know. I mean, I think historians will be historians. I'm not sure what we've done will necessarily encourage other meteorologists to do what we did, I do think it might encourage other historians to use other tools that might be at their disposal. I think, look, people just want to know about the future. I mean, I know the past is interesting in many ways, but you and I, we are the people that folks turn to know about the future. We have a special place in society, and sometimes we're the butt of jokes because of it. But there is something to be said for foretelling the future. It's been something people have been doing, trying to do for millennia. And you and I are fortunate to be in a field where the technology just gets a little better every year, right? And extend those forecasts a little bit farther. So I think most of the attention will still be on the future, but I do think some historians may be motivated to use some of the tools we've introduced to look back.
Well, the last episode I did with you was incredibly popular, so there is interest in the past as well.
I'm glad, and I think that's where I'm going to be dwelling for a while.
It's a nice place to be, right?
My day job looks to the future, or shall I say, my one piece of my day job looks to the future, and this piece will continue to look backward.
Dr. Nese, is there anything else you want to add about your book? Where can we find it? When is it coming out? When are you going to sign my copy?
Next time we're together, the book comes out officially June 10th. I feel very blessed to have been invited with my co-author, Jeffrey Harding, to speak in Gettysburg on July 5th this year in something called the Sacred Trust, which is sponsored by the Gettysburg Foundation. Every year they invite 3, 4, 5 speakers back, and we'll be speaking on the 5th. I feel really blessed to have that opportunity. Yeah, I forget what the question was.
Where can we find your book?
Yeah, anytime. Open invitation. Open invitation. Let's meet in Gettysburg. We'll get Jeff there. You will never, if you spend 2 hours of your day on the battlefield with Mr. Jeffrey Harding, you are going to be in for a treat. You will get chills at what he knows and how he can bring those 3 hellish days in Gettysburg to life for anyone who's interested in a deeper dive. And so I know Jeff would extend an invitation to you, Emily, to meet in Gettysburg sometime. And I'm sure he'd be thrilled to give you a tour.
I'd be honored. That's awesome. And your adult weather camp, how do people get involved in that in future years?
The camp is run through an organization called Road Scholar. So it's a play on Rhodes Scholar, but it's ROAD Scholar. And we being the Penn State Department of Meteorology and Atmospheric Science, specifically me, contract out with them to host their program on our campus during the first week of June. So if you're interested, I just call it an adult weather camp because that's really what it is, because we also have weather camps for high school and middle school kids here at Penn State. So this is kind of a play on that. But if you're truly interested, you just go to the Road Scholar website, and I think we're already booking for 26. Nice. So it's an adventure. Let me just tell you, it's an intense week because these folks want to be here. They want to learn about the weather.
I can't tell you how many people have told me as adults, I wish I had become a meteorologist. I think my dad is one of them.
Well, and this is your chance. And you know what? We go on field trips. State College, Pennsylvania, where Penn State is located, is rich in meteorology. We are fortunate to have a local office of the National Weather Service. We are fortunate that the world headquarters for the private company AccuWeather is here in State College. And so we take campers on field trips. I mean, you get to go inside a National Weather Service office. You get to go inside a private weather forecasting company. I mean, that's pretty cool stuff.
Very cool.
So yeah, that's what adult weather camp is.
Awesome. Jon Nese, thank you so much for your time today. Once again, this was a great learning experience. This book is great. I encourage everybody to get it out.
Thank you.
It will be out by the time this comes out. So thank you so much.